Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
My parents told me they couldn't afford my surgery, and I believed them because I wanted to believe that somewhere deep inside, beneath all the years of favoritism and casual neglect, they would put my well-being before appearances or bragging rights. I remember sitting across from them at the kitchen table, the pale light from the overhead fixture making my father's thinning hair glow like a halo, while my mother stirred her coffee so long the spoon kept clinking like a metronome for my growing anxiety. I told them the numbers from the doctor, explained how serious the situation was becoming, and for a brief moment I thought I saw my mother's face soften, as if she might reach across the table and take my hand, but then my father sighed and said, "Rachel, you know we just don't have that kind of money lying around." That was it. No promise to try, no suggestion of taking a loan, no whisper of empathy. Just a firm closing of the door in my face. I left that day telling myself that maybe they truly were stretched thin, that maybe the retirement accounts and the mortgage and the thousand little expenses had eaten away at anything they could have offered. But 3 weeks later, scrolling on my phone while trying to ignore the dull ache in my side that had become my daily companion, I stopped cold when a post popped up from my brother Ethan's account. There he was, beaming like a celebrity in front of a pale yellow vacation house in Florida, a drink in his hand and our parents standing proudly on either side of him. The caption read, "Dream come true, thanks to Mom and Dad for making this possible." My stomach turned in a way that had nothing to do with my illness. I stared at the smiling faces, the way my father held the keys like a game show host presenting the grand prize, and I realized with a sharp clarity that the story I had been told was a lie. The money existed, plenty of it apparently, but it wasn't for me. It was for Ethan, the golden child who had always been coddled, defended, and bailed out of every poor decision. I thought back to when I was in high school and asked for help paying for a summer program in New York. My parents told me it was too much of a luxury, yet the same summer Ethan got a brand new used car. The pattern had been there all along, I just didn't want to admit it until now. The bitterness grew heavier with each passing day, especially as the medical bills started to arrive in thick envelopes stamped with urgent red lettering. Every time I opened one, it felt like a reminder not only of my deteriorating health, but also of how disposable I was in my own family. I tried not to tell my friends the whole truth because the humiliation stung worse than the pain. What kind of person has parents who will pay for their son to have a vacation property, but won't help their daughter stand upright without clutching the walls? Ethan, of course, basked in the glow of his new life. He posted photos of sunsets from the deck, beer bottles lined up like trophies on the railing, captions about "grind now, relax later," as though he had built any of this himself. The comments were full of our parents gushing, "So proud of you, honey. You deserve it all." Reading those words was like taking a blade between the ribs, not because I envied the house, but because I understood, finally and without denial, that my parents had chosen. They had drawn the line in the sand, and I was on the wrong side of it. The tension between what I needed and what they gave him became unbearable. I kept my distance, avoided their calls, but one evening as I sat on the couch clutching yet another medical bill, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, the voice on the other end was curt, professional, and utterly devoid of compassion. A collections agency, asking when they could expect payment. I mumbled something about sorting it out, but as soon as the call ended, my eyes drifted back to my phone screen. Ethan had just posted another photo. This time our parents were laughing, glasses raised high, the caption reading, "Celebrating new beginnings." The contrast was too sharp, too cruel, and I sat there in my dimly lit apartment, clutching the bill with its threats and deadlines, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and realizing that the people who had given me life had also decided that my life was worth less than my brother's weekend view of the ocean. The thought sank into me slowly, like a stone settling at the bottom of a pond, heavy and immovable. And that was the moment I understood that something inside me had broken, something that would never be put back together the way it once was. I didn't know it then, but that phone call, paired with Ethan's smug smile on my screen, was the first push down a road I had never intended to walk. I thought I would be the one quietly suffering while they celebrated, but the truth was, resentment has a way of sharpening into something else. Something colder, quieter, and much more dangerous. When the dull ache that had been pacing circles in my side turned into a steady, mean pressure that made me hold my breath at red lights and sit on the edge of the tub pretending that steam could loosen something inside me that stubbornly refused to move. I realized that denial had been my cheapest anesthetic, and like everything cheap it wore off at the worst possible moment, which happened to be a Tuesday when my manager asked if I could stay late to close, and I smiled while thinking that if I stood another hour my legs would shake like a folding chair with a loose screw. I told myself to keep it together, to answer emails, to be polite to customers who wanted discounts they didn't deserve, and to pretend that the numbers on those bills weren't stacking into a tower that would tip directly onto my chest. But then the mail slot clacked and I found another envelope with its red threats and tidy columns, and I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, reading the same paragraph 3 times because my eyes kept blurring, and I thought that if pain were money my account would finally be funded. My parents called in the evening to ask if I had seen Ethan's latest post about the boat he'd got a deal on down by the marina, and when I said that I had seen it and that I was happy he had found a way to relax between all the hard work of choosing patio furniture and filming sunsets, my mother snapped that sarcasm makes people bitter. Which was funny coming from a woman who could peel the skin off anyone with a single compliment. I tried again to bring the conversation back to my doctor's timeline, to the phrase sooner is better, to the whisper that untreated could become unfixable, and my father cleared his throat in the way he does right before the conversation moves to safer ground. Which is how we went from my test results to his concerns about property taxes in a single sentence, and by the time the call ended my jaw hurt from clenching and my apartment felt like a classroom where I was the only one who had read the assignment. The invitation to Ethan's housewarming arrived like a dare slipped under my door, the card thick and smug with a photo of the pale yellow house and a script font that promised sunset cocktails and family love, which made me laugh out loud in a way that sounded a little feral even to me. I turned the card over, saw the request for no gifts because your presence is the present, and thought that people who say that already bought themselves everything they wanted, and that maybe presents, in my case, could arrive wrapped in something other than politeness. That night, while the pain flowed like a tide and the ceiling fan ticked, I opened a blank page on my laptop and built a small machine that looked like generosity and ran on gasoline. I created a modest public fundraiser that didn't feature my photo or my diagnosis or any pleading language, just a crisp headline that read, "In honor of Ethan's beach house, help a family member get the care she needs," followed by a short paragraph noting that in lieu of gifts, guests could contribute to the health and peace of mind of someone who has cheered Ethan on through every milestone, with a quiet note that the contributions would be anonymous and that gratitude would be expressed privately after the procedure. And because I understand my family's ecosystem better than they do, I set the organizer name to a friend, linked a brand new email, and coded the thank you message to say, "Ethan will be so touched you honored his new beginning this way." I added the event date, embedded the donation link inside a digital invitation that looked nearly identical to his glossy card, and used the guest list posted in his public event to send it to the same people who would be sipping cocktails on his deck, including a cousin whose favorite hobby is forwarding things with commentary. By morning, the first contributions trickled in. The small-town aunt who always buys 2 church raffle tickets donated the cost of 1 nice casserole. Ethan's college friend added the price of an overpriced dockside dinner. And a neighbor who never misses the chance to look magnanimous publicly commented, "Beautiful idea, love wins," which I screenshotted purely for archival purposes that may or may not have included future silence. I knew this wasn't a flood and didn't need to be, because the point wasn't the money. I had already started stitching together my own plan to cover the initial hospital deposit with a grim cocktail of overtime, selling 3 pieces of jewelry I didn't love, and a payment plan that would make my accountant wince. The point was that people who were trained to applaud Ethan would now be standing with a drink in one hand and a phone in the other, wondering why a family that could underwrite a beach view needed strangers to help a daughter breathe without counting steps, and that private wondering, that little sand grain of discomfort, would start to grind. Around lunch the calls began. starting with my mother, who sounded breezy in the way that means a storm is rehearsing its lines, asking if I had seen some ridiculous online thing, and whether people were trying to exploit Ethan's good news to push their own agendas. Which, she added, is deeply tacky and not the kind of energy we want at the party, and I told her I had no idea what she meant, and that maybe the universe had decided to balance things in its own odd way, after which she launched into a speech about family loyalty that I let wash over me like noise from a neighbor's TV set. Then Ethan texted a screenshot of the fundraiser and asked if this was my doing, adding a nervous joke about me being the only person he knew who could write sentences without line breaks. And I stared at the screen long enough to feel the pause become its own message before I replied that I was busy comparing payment plans and that if he wanted to make something right he could start by calling the person who deserved those congratulations least, which I knew would land like a puzzle with one missing piece. That night, as the donations and the whispers braided themselves into a net that would tighten just enough to leave marks by the weekend, I let the fan tick and the ache roll, and I pictured the first toasts clinking on that pretty deck while phones buzzed in back pockets. And I felt a small, cold satisfaction that wasn't triumph so much as calibration, the needle moving one notch toward fairness, and if that made me unkind then fine, I would wear unkind-like armor until I could shrug it off for something softer. When I set the phone face down and the room finally quieted, a new text blinked through from an unknown number with a single sentence that made the corner of my mouth lift despite myself. About that fundraiser, could we talk before Saturday? I told myself I would not go, that I would stay home with a bowl of pasta and a heating pad and a documentary I would only half watch, but Saturday arrived warm and smug, the sky a careless blue that made the whole city look like it had given itself a facial. And I found myself ironing a dress I hadn't worn in years, the kind that says I can handle your nonsense without saying it out loud, and I drove toward Ethan's beach house with a bag of limes on the passenger seat, because if you arrive empty-handed you are rude, but if you arrive with something so utilitarian it can be replaced at a gas station you are making a point. The house looked like a postcard tinted by good credit and parental absolution, its clapboard siding scrubbed to a buttery shine, and the deck a bleached stage where laughter could be heard before it had earned the right to be called genuine. And as I climbed the steps with my saccharine smile and my grocery store citrus, I could feel the familiar choreography of family performance tightening around my ribs like a corset I no longer agreed to wear. Inside, the party moved with the engine of polite excess, glassware chiming like polite doorbells, the kitchen island covered in appetizers that had been photographed before they were eaten. Ethan performing his guided tour with the confidence of a man who has never had to earn applause, and my parents circulating with their carefully tuned pride that translated into phrases like "we sacrificed" and "we believed" and "he worked so hard." All of it true in the way a movie based on a true story is true, if you squint. When my mother hugged me, she smelled like expensive powder and practiced worry. She asked if I was feeling better in a tone that suggested wellness is a choice, then drifted toward a neighbor she wanted to impress, leaving me with a flute of champagne and the tight little smile you give a person you used to trust with your future. Because revenge that draws blood is messy and obvious, while revenge that rearranges air pressure is elegant and deniable, I placed my first small device in motion by setting 3 folded cards on the cocktail table near the sliding doors, each one cream-colored and tasteful with a line of script that read, "In honor of Ethan's new beginning, consider a contribution to help a family member get the care she needs," followed by a tiny printed square that led to the fundraiser page when scanned, and although I did not so much as glance at the guests as they picked up the cards with the same reflex that makes people check their reflections in dark windows, I heard the first tiny intake of breath travel through the room like a breeze slipping under a door, followed by the rustle of questions disguised as compliments, and in those small sounds I felt the most satisfying click of a door latch I have ever staged. Someone said this is so thoughtful, someone else murmured I had no idea, and the neighbor who always wears nautical stripes asked loudly whether Ethan had set this up himself, because what a man, prompting an older aunt to say, with the precision of a needle sliding into cloth, that generosity starts at home and sometimes at the doctor's office. And I watched my parents' faces arrange themselves into expressions that were part surprise and part careful calculation, which is exactly the ratio they reserve for inconvenient truths. Ethan was less subtle. He cornered me near the hallway and asked in a whisper that tried and failed to be kind whether this was my way of clearing the air, and I replied that air clears itself if you open a window, which is a simple fact and not a metaphor. Then I asked where the bathroom was because my body had decided to remind me that pain does not take intermissions for social theater, and he pointed me toward the first door on the left like a docent who wants you to keep moving so you don't touch the art. The bathroom was immaculate in the way rental listings promise and reality rarely delivers, and when I came out, still breathing carefully, I noticed that the office door down the hall was ajar, a sliver of light cutting across the floorboards like a suggestion. And I heard the low hum of a printer cooling, the kind of domestic detail that tells you this room is used for actual decisions rather than Pinterest boards. I stood there longer than politeness allows, then slid inside. With the same quiet attention I used when Mom kept receipts in a shoebox she thought I never opened, and on the desk I found a neat stack of documents held by a clip that had been positioned with the precision of a man who believes paper behaves if you ask nicely. There were loan disclosures that looked exactly as boring as you'd expect until they didn't, because attached to them was a letter from my parents' accountant explaining the gift of equity they had provided to help with the down payment, along with a sentence that made my mouth go dry and my heartbeat lift like a startled bird. Given prior discussions regarding Rachel's outstanding medical costs, we elected to defer any health-related support to a future tax year to avoid exceeding the annual exclusion limits, which is a civilized way of saying we chose the house over the hospital and wanted to keep the paperwork tidy. I photographed the letter, the disclosures, and a note clipped to a folder labeled Homestead that contained a draft claiming primary residence on a property that would very clearly be used as a vacation rental based on the glossy welcome binder listing nearby charter services and a laminated chart of peak season rates, and in that moment I understood that this house was not only a shrine to favoritism, but also a structure built atop small lies that could grow teeth if introduced to the right officials. I did not shout. I returned to the party, slipped my phone into my bag, and let the second small device hum to life. Before leaving the office, I had emailed the Homeowners Association address listed on the binder with a polite inquiry about short-term rental approvals and doc modifications under a brand new account named Aftercare Questions, attaching a photo of the laminated rate sheet and asking whether hurricane compliance required a different railing height for rental properties. A question so specific and helpful that no one would read malice into it until the board meeting notes turned prickly. Back in the kitchen, I refilled a tray with limes and said something cheerful about garnish being the democracy of cocktails, a line that bought me 3 laughs and 1 narrowed glance from my mother. And then the energy of the room shifted almost imperceptibly as phones began to vibrate with notifications from the fundraiser page where donations ticked upward in small but pointed increments, and the neighbor in stripes raised her glass to Ethan and to quiet courage in the family, which made my father put down his drink and press his lips together in a straight line he usually reserves for traffic jams and invoices. When the sun tipped low and the deck filled with the gold light people pay extra to sit beneath, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my dress with a message from a number I did not recognize. A crisp sentence without greeting or sign-off that made the back of my neck cool despite the heat. This is the county property appraiser's office. Regarding the homestead exemption application at your brother's address, we may have a few questions. When the message from the county appraiser landed like a pin dropped on a glass table, brief, impersonal, hinting at the kind of attention no one invites on purpose, I stood at the edge of Ethan's deck where the last light scraped the water and let the wind cool the heat that had risen behind my eyes, then tucked the phone away with the smoothness of someone who has just realized that inevitability can be engineered one nudge at a time, because while I did not plan to burn the house down, I had every intention of opening the windows wide enough that the truth would blow through and rearrange the furniture. Ethan found me there with the alert, tight smile of a man who has been hearing his name in sentences he cannot control, and he started a rambling explanation about how homestead forms are confusing and how the HOA lady loves to flex. and how this is all noise we can fix if we just present the story correctly, to which I replied that if he wanted to present a story, he should start at the beginning and include the part where our parents called my doctor's estimate premature, while wiring equity like confetti, and I watched something guarded flicker across his face, the first faint recognition that the old script might not sell anymore. At least not to me. The next afternoon, while my mother sent me a text shaped like concern and padded with the soft menace of etiquette, darling, can we talk before this gets blown out of proportion? I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of my bills and the photos I had taken in Ethan's office, and I made a quiet braid out of 3 strands I knew would hold. A politely phrased email to the HOA board asking whether the dock extensions shown in several public posts had received written approval under the short-term rental guidelines, a brief, factual note to the county appraiser attaching the draft homestead form beside the laminated rate sheet that called the house a premium seasonal retreat, and inquiring about the definition of primary residence for tax purposes, and a message to a real estate friend who cultivates gossip with professional precision, sharing that a certain family in her market seems to be advertising nightly rates while chasing tax benefits reserved for people who actually sleep where they brush their teeth, which is not a moral judgment so much as a civic palate cleanser, and by the time I hit send on the 3rd message, I felt the satisfying click of a boundary being enforced without a single raised voice. Meanwhile, the fundraiser, which had started as a mirror held up to the party's polished face, began to function like a thermometer in a room where some guests suddenly felt a draft. Because donations kept arriving in sums that were not grand but were persistently human, an old teacher, a distant cousin who wrote for the one who always brought the extra chairs at Thanksgiving, a coworker who signed only with a heartless office nickname, and each notification tightened the social screws around my parents, who still tried to frame the whole thing as an unfortunate misunderstanding, which, if we are speaking technically, is accurate in the sense that they had misunderstood the elasticity of my patience. I booked the first part of my procedure using a hospital payment plan that reads like punishment, but sounds like survival when you are practicing it. Then I sent myself an email I titled After, because I had learned that hope, to be useful, should be put on a calendar and given a to-do list, and I breathed easier, not because the pain had lessened, but because the future no longer felt like a hallway with the lights off. Ethan called late that evening with the voice of a person trying to smile through a tight door chain, asking whether I had spoken to anyone official because a letter had arrived requesting clarification about residency and rental status, and could we please keep this within the family since prying eyes are cruel. And I told him that prying eyes are often the only ones that see what polite eyes refuse to notice. Then I asked if he'd read the accountant's note that explicitly named me as a budgetary inconvenience, and there was a long silence punctuated by the tiny sound of him swallowing before he said that he had not realized the language would be so cold, which I translated as a first shard of comprehension pushing through the old soil. I suggested he make a donation to the fundraiser in an amount equal to 1 month of his mortgage, if only to steady the optics, and he said that would look like an admission, and I said it would look like a brother, and the line went quiet again in a way that made me think of the night we were kids, and he broke our mother's glass paperweight, and I told the truth for both of us, which apparently had been my job for a long time. Because revenge that broadcasts itself loses altitude, while revenge that behaves like consequence tends to fly straighter, I took one more step that felt less like a strike than a lever. I forwarded a compact packet, screenshots, accountant snippet, rental advertisements, to the compliance department at Ethan's company with a courteous note that he might not have disclosed a potential conflict between personal business use and client entertaining, not because I wanted him fired, but because I wanted the adults he respected to speak in the crisp tones my parents never used with him, and I signed it with my own name because secrecy is only romantic until it trips you in the dark. Hours later, he texted that his manager wanted a conversation about appearances, and my mother left a voicemail about family unity and prayer, and how gossip is a poison that weak people drink to feel strong. And I stood at my sink rinsing a plate and thought that strength looks, to some people, like refusing dessert after they have eaten your dinner. When the county office followed up to schedule a quick verification visit and the HOA circulated an agenda item about unauthorized short-term rentals that sounded conspicuously tailored to one address, my father suggested a Sunday lunch to straighten all this out, which translated to an attempt at folding this chaos into the tidy linen napkin of our usual choreography, and I agreed because I wanted them to look me in the eye while we decided whether we were a family or a ruse. I arrived with a copy of my hospital deposit receipt and placed it beside their plates before they could deploy the script about timing and misunderstandings, and I watched my mother's mouth form a small, perfect oval while my father tapped the paper as if it might reveal a trick, and I told them in a voice that surprised even me that I had handled the beginning and would handle the middle. But the end would require them to decide whether they preferred a son with an uncomplicated tax bill or a daughter who might one day invite them to meet a grandchild without flinching, and the boundary hung there between us like a porch light that only I controlled. We ate in the uneasy quiet that follows a weather alert when the sirens have stopped, but the air has not yet decided whether to relax, and while Ethan stared at his hands as if they were a translation he could not read, my phone buzzed with a new message from a number labeled Simply Bored that contained a short sentence promising next steps after review. And I slid the phone into my bag without breaking eye contact with the two people who had taught me to say please and thank you but had never said I am sorry without a coupon attached, and I smiled in a way that was not unkind and not forgiving either, then asked whether anyone wanted coffee, because I had one more thing to say before we stopped pretending we all wanted the same future. I poured coffee at my parents' table with the steady hands of a waitress who already knows the tip will be smaller than the effort and said, as if confirming the weather, that the fundraiser would close on Monday and that every donor would receive a note explaining that their kindness had covered the first hospital payment and the follow-up imaging that my doctor insisted we schedule without delay, which, I added with the kind of smile you wear when trying on a new version of yourself, means I am moving forward whether or not this family decides to move with me, and I watched the fact of it pass across their faces like a slow front, my mother arranging concern into a neat bouquet while my father blinked as if the room had dimmed and someone else had left with the light bulb. Ethan cleared his throat and said he would transfer a month of mortgage money that afternoon, not because optics matter, though of course they do, but because he had read the accountant's line again and finally understood that the sentence did not describe a budget so much as a choice, and my chest tightened. Not with the familiar ache, but with a pinch of something like grief, because late understanding is still understanding. Yet it arrives with a shadow that keeps you watching the door even after the apology sits down. When the county appraiser's car rolled past their window on the following day and idled for a minute, my phone buzzed with a brief thanks for the clarifications I had provided and a note that the homestead request would be paused pending documentation of primary residence, which is bureaucratic for you may enjoy the house you love, but not the tax shelter you prefer, and almost immediately Ethan's manager left a voicemail stating that the firm would rather avoid the impression that client entertaining had blurred into undisclosed personal rentals, while the Homeowners Association circulated minutes from an emergency meeting where the board, in language so polite it squeaked, reminded members that nightly listings require prior written approval and that any dock modifications must meet hurricane standards verified by an inspection that, coincidentally, begins next week on several addresses, including one very photogenic pale yellow property, and by the time the neighborhood group chat discovered its moral backbone, my parents were sending me links to articles about forgiveness, as if doctrine could be fitted over hypocrisy like a slipcover, and I, standing at my sink with my hands in soapy water, allowed myself the smallest laugh because sometimes the most elegant revenge is simply to move a mere 2 inches to the left and invite people to look, then step aside while they decide whether they like what they see. The surgery itself did not offer the cinematic catharsis television promises because the body negotiates in whispered clauses and extended timelines. Yet when I woke in recovery with the anesthetics fog rolling back like low tide and heard a nurse say that everything had gone to plan and that the next steps were boring and necessary and achievable, I pressed the heel of my hand against the tender place below my ribs and said thank you with the sincerity of a person who has learned to celebrate incremental victories, and later, alone in my apartment with a pharmacy's worth of instructions and a stack of clean pillowcases. I read every donor note until the screen blurred and I realized that strangers and near strangers had done for me what my own parents had argued was impossible, which is both a comfort and a wound. And perhaps these two things are not opposites so much as neighbors who share a wall and complain about the noise. I did not expect my parents to transform overnight into people who choose their daughter over their narrative, yet when they invited me to Sunday dinner a month later with the measured enthusiasm of hosts unsure whether the guest of honor will attend, I went. Not to audition for reconciliation, but to try out neutrality, and I arrived with flowers from the discount bucket and a pie I bought on the way because contribution, however small, keeps you from feeling like an exhibit and over chicken. That was slightly too dry, and stories that were slightly too polished. My mother slid an envelope across the table containing a check that represented, in round numbers and spiky handwriting, a portion of what the down payment had devoured, saying that it was not everything and not enough and still something, and that maybe next year they could do more. And I heard the effort, I did, but I also heard the conditional future that had nearly swallowed me, so I folded the paper and put it in my bag. Without commentary, reserving the right to decide later whether money can pay interest on trust. For Ethan, consequences arrived not as a grand fall, but as a series of adjustments that scrape pride like sand against a boat hull, because he removed the online listings, refiled the exemption properly, apologized to his manager with the kind of sincerity that sounds better when your voice catches, and sold the doc extension at a loss that he called tuition, and when he asked if I might be willing to spend a weekend at the house once everything is above board, I told him I would consider it. When walking the stairs didn't feel like a negotiation, and when our parents could sit on that deck without telling a single story in which they are the heroes, and he nodded, which might be the most adult sound he has made in years. On the night the fundraiser closed, I wrote individual thank yous, careful and specific, then drafted a message to my parents that I did not send, a message that said, I am not staying away to punish you, I am staying away to hear myself think. Which sounds dramatic, and maybe it is, yet when you have been the quiet ledger line under someone else's celebration, you need a season where the math is only yours. And as I stared at the unsent note, the phone lit with a holiday photo from my parents. Matching sweaters, a tree that looked tired, the caption insisting that family is everything, and I found myself wondering, not whether to forgive, which is private work that blooms or doesn't in its own stubborn time, but whether they truly do not know why I do not come around, or whether they have decided that confusion is friendlier than confession. And I placed the phone face down and watched the ceiling shadow from the streetlight inch across the plaster like a tide mark, thinking that perhaps the most honest ending is not a confession or a reunion, but a pause in which everyone decides what kind of people they are without an audience, and that maybe, just maybe, I will drive down to the pale yellow house one off-season afternoon when the beach looks like a memory and ring the bell, or maybe I will not, and both possibilities, held at once, feel like the first choice that has belonged entirely to me.